Today I'm sewing and sharing a hacked version of the oversized tee pattern by Ellie and Mac. The original pattern is intended for knit fabric, but I'm sewing mine today in a woven. I'll show you all the changes that I've made to this pattern, including the sleeve design, the back neck buttonhole, and the center back seam. I made this pattern once before in a cotton eyelet fabric, and today I'm sewing it once again in a cotton floral woven. I've left a link to the original pattern below so you can check out all the details, grab a copy, and hack this pattern with me. Grab that pattern and come sew along with me. Here is my oversized tee pattern, and I'm going to mark the lines for the front and back pieces. I'm going to be marking the front and back pieces for the crew neck option. And then you have multiple options at the bottom for how long you want your shirt to be. I'm going to mark my length about 3/4 down between the long hem option and the regular length option. And now I can cut out this pattern piece. The front and the back are the same pattern piece, the only difference is the depth of this neckline. So this would be the back piece that I cut from my fabric, and this will be the front piece that I cut from my fabric. I'm also going to customize the length from my neck to my shoulder. I want my sleeve to sit comfortably right before the end of my shoulder. I'm going to measure the distance from my neck to just before my shoulder ends, which for me, I want this length to be 4.5 inches. So I'm going to make a mark from the neckline to 4.5 inches before the shoulder ends. Now I want to blend my new shoulder line with my underarm. I'm going to cut off that excess paper. Now you can hold this pattern piece in front of your body and see if you're happy with the depth of this armhole. If you'd like to raise up that depth a little bit, that's easy to do. Use the scrap of paper that we just removed. Tape back a corner of it to customize the distance that you'd like the depth of your armhole to be. So if you'd like to raise it up, say 1.5 inches, you can add that amount, mark the line of your new armhole side seam, and then blend that back in. And now we're ready to cut our fabric. Cut your front piece on the fold. And before you cut your back pieces, make sure that you're cutting at the right neckline. We're going to be adding a seam at the center back so that we can add a buttonhole at the top. So we're going to cut the back pieces mirrored, adding a 1/4 inch seam allowance at the center back. Before I sew together the center back seam, I want to finish both of these seams separately. Sew over these raw edges with your zigzag stitch or use your serger. Now we can place these serged edges right sides together and pin that center seam. Now we're going to sew this center back seam and we're going to start our stitching 5.5 inches below that neckline. I've placed a pin here at that 5.5 inch marking, and now I'm going to sew this center back seam from my pin, back stitching to secure all the way down to the bottom of the garment, using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then press open this entire seam allowance. To finish the edges of this buttonhole slit at the back neck, we're going to sew from the top alongside our serging stitches until we reach the slit opening. Then we're going to sew across to the other serging stitches and pivot once again, coming up along that side. Now place your front piece right sides together with your back piece, matching your shoulders and side seams, and pin in place. Sew your shoulder seams and your side seams with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and finish your seams in your preferred method, either with a zigzag stitch or your serger. Now using a flexible ruler, I'm going to measure the circumference of my armhole. Each side is 9.5 inches, so the total circumference is 19. I want the length of the sleeve that I cut to be 1.5 times the circumference of this armhole. So 19 times 1.5 is 28.5. So I'm going to cut the length of my sleeves to 28.5 inches long and 7.5 inches wide. And cut 2 of these sleeve rectangles. Fold your sleeve piece in half right sides together, matching the short edges. And go ahead and pin this seam. Sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and press your seams open. Now that we've sewn that seam, fold your sleeve in half wrong sides together lengthwise and give that a good press all the way around. Now we're going to take this to the sewing machine and baste all along the raw edges, starting and stopping on either side of the seam, making sure to leave thread tails on both sides so that you have threads to pull for gathering. Now we're going to place our sleeve into this armhole. Match the seam of the sleeve with the underarm seam of your bodice, placing the sleeve right sides together with the bodice and pin in place. Now start pulling your gathering stitches from your sleeve until the sleeve perfectly fits the armhole. Once the sleeve fits the armhole and the gathers are distributed evenly, go ahead and pin in place all the way around. And then we're going to sew all around this armhole with about a 1/4 inch seam allowance and then serge or zigzag the seams to finish. And you'll repeat all of these steps to attach your other sleeve to the other armhole. For your neckline binding, you can use store-bought bias tape, or you can create your own bias tape from your main fabric. I've just cut a strip from my main fabric at a 45-degree angle to the selvage, and it's 1.5 inches wide. I pressed both of my edges to meet in the center, and then folded it in half one more time to create double fold bias tape. Now I'm ready to apply it to my neckline. Fold one of the short edges of your bias tape to the wrong side by about 1/2 inch. Match up that folded edge of your bias tape with the center back opening, also matching up the top raw edges, and pin in place. Continue pinning all the way around until you're back at the opposite center back. Now at the opposite center back, I'm going to trim off the excess bias tape, leaving again a 1/2 inch portion extending beyond the center back. Fold back that 1/2 inch portion and pin in place. Now I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and sew right in line with the crease in my bias tape closest to the edge of the fabric. Sew from center back all the way around to the opposite center back, back stitching at the beginning and the end of your stitches. Now that binding is attached, go ahead and trim that seam allowance all around the neckline all the way around. Trim by about 1/2. I'm also going to use sharp scissors to clip to the stitching line but not beyond. This way, when we turn the bias tape to the right side, we'll get a much nicer curve around that neckline. Then I'm going to take this to my ironing board and press that seam with the bias tape opened out. Careful to just use the tip of my iron so that I don't disturb the creases in my bias tape. Now to finish binding the neckline, take the raw edge of your bias tape, fold it along the crease closest to the raw edge, and then fold the bias tape on your center crease. The folded edge of the bias tape should just cover the stitching line, and pin in place all the way around. As you're pinning all the way around, just make sure that the short raw edge of your bias tape is still tucked under. There are different ways you can choose to create your button loop at the back opening. I just took a strip of scrap fabric, measuring about 1 inch by 3.5 inches, and I folded those raw edges to meet in the middle, and then folded it in half just as I did for the bias tape. Now I'm going to take it to my sewing machine and sew those folded edges closed. And then you can trim your button loop to your desired length. Mine is about 2 inches long. Fold that in half, and then you're going to tuck it in between the bias tape at one of the center back openings. Tuck in the raw edges of the loop by about 1/2 inch and pin in place. And now that button loop is encased within the bias binding. Now we can take our binding to the sewing machine, sewing from the right side of the garment, along the bias tape about 1/8 inch from the original seam line. Additionally, to secure your button loop, Sew back and forth a few times along that vertical edge. Now using a needle and thread, sew your button to your opposite center back opening. Now the only thing left to do is hem the bottom of the shirt. I've gone ahead and serged my raw edges all along the bottom hem all the way around. You can try on your top to determine how much you want to hem. I'm just folding up that bottom serged edge by 5/8 of an inch, and I gave that a good press all the way around. Now I'm going to go to my machine and sew close to these serged stitches all the way around the garment. Give everything a nice final press and you're all done with your top. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you check out my other videos for more great sewing inspiration, and I'll see you in the next video.